Welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba Solidarity podcast from a Canadian perspective. My name is Cam Scott, and I'm joined by Samantha Hislop. We're here to talk about Cuba and all things Cuba. Of course, that is what we do here. We'd spoken on a previous episode of the ways in which the United States, to quote Grandma, has violated the principles of Olympism and the attack on Cuban sport, but this reaches new lows in the last week or so. Perhaps you could fill us in a little bit about what's going on in that world.
So the United States government has denied the Cuban girls youth softball team the opportunity to participate in the Little League World Series in the age 9 to 10-year-old category, and the competition was to be in Puerto Rico. So the 14 girls were granted visas, but all of the 7 adult members that were part of the coaching and support staff were denied entry to the United States. Their visas were denied. So obviously these girl athletes are unable to travel to Puerto Rico without their adult coaching staff, and they're not able to compete. So it's just another part of this current offensive by the United States government to hinder Cuban athletic and other areas too of academic or cultural or artistic exchange. But in this case, we're talking about sports. They're hindering Cubans from being able to exchange and travel to other countries to compete, to collaborate outside of their homeland, and denying them opportunities. So it's cruel. These are little kids. It's really hard. I can't imagine, my son, when he gets to that age, something like that happening, like, trying to explain to a child 9 or 10 years old that you don't get to compete in the Little League World Series because of politics and because none of our coaching staff can go. So it's just cruel. It's petty. And they stole the dreams of these little girls, probably being able to participate in the Little League World Series. This is part of an ongoing trend of visa denials to athletes. Cuba's national women's volleyball team was recently denied visas to attend a tournament in Puerto Rico as well. And this was organized by the North, Central America, and Caribbean Volleyball Federation. So what's happening is when they're denying visas to athletes, whether it's affecting a little girls softball team or women's volleyball, also men's volleyball has been affected as well. And you have to remember too, volleyball is a huge sport in Cuba. Cuba is one of the top countries in volleyball. When you think of Cuba, you think of baseball, volleyball, wrestling, boxing, and athletics, track and field as well. But the men's volleyball team, there was a competition that I can't remember which country it was in, but it was in Europe, and there was a tournament, and the visas, they did get the visas, but they were so delayed that they literally walked onto the court and they kind of walked on the court and just started playing. Like, they didn't even get to warm up, which anybody who's played competitive sports too, that's like a risk for injury as well. Also, there's a mental aspect, like psychologically, like you need to be prepared for your competition. But the coaches and athletes were just kind of running into the venue, onto the court to play, because probably they're waiting to the final hour to get their visas. They finally got them, and they had to get flights, and so that's just how their travel was impacted. The good part of that story about the men's volleyball team, though, is that they performed very well. And actually, just the other day, this week, the Cuban men's volleyball team beat Poland, who is number 1 in the world.
Oh, right.
So I love to see it, right? But it's just ridiculous that they have to go through those obstacles. And as I said, the women's national volleyball team was not able to go to Puerto Rico to compete in a tournament. And all of these things, sometimes these are qualifying tournaments, or sometimes they're competitions that affect rankings as well. And when even if your rankings are affected, That means, for example, at the Olympics, or depending what sport you're in, a world championship or whatever it may be, if you're ranked lower because you weren't able to attend, not because you lost but because you couldn't even compete, if your ranking is low because of that, it puts you at a disadvantage in really important competitions, because that means you're facing usually tougher competition from the get-go on your road to a championship or a gold medal or whatever. So it's an attack on sports in Cuba by denying athletes and their coaches visas. And sports are really important in Cuba. They approach sports differently in Cuba. It's a showcase of Cuban traditions, feelings, pride, and sports are meant to be accessible to everybody of all backgrounds and all ages. It's not like, in Canada, if anybody has kids and they have their kids in sports or the arts or anything, you're paying out the behind to put them in those programs. And it just gets more and more expensive for equipment costs, training, coaches, teachers, facilities, uniforms, all of that stuff. It's so expensive. So what you see more and more in a country like our country, like Canada, is that the kids that have the advantage are the ones whose parents have the money to put them into those programs and on those teams and get access to higher level of training and coaching and things like that. So in Cuba, they don't approach it that way. Now, of course, with the blockade, that affects the material resources that Cuba has for its athletes. So, facilities are in need of maintenance. Equipment is hard to come by. Even for some athletes at the very high level, it's not easy to get the equipment that they need. They've got the coaching staff, they've got the programs, they've got the institutions, they've got the knowledge, they've got the experience. Cuba has the second highest number of gold medals in the Olympics in the Western Hemisphere besides the United States. Cuba has always been a powerhouse in sports and athletics, but in recent years, we've seen the medal counts steadily going down because, one reason is, like I said, the impact of the blockade on their economy, their ability to purchase equipment and resources for training, even nutrition for athletes, being able to eat right and fuel your body is difficult, even for the highest level athlete. And then also at the same time, you've got other countries luring Cuban athletes to defect from their team and get citizenship in another country and compete for another country and get sponsorship in another country. That's happening a lot. It has been happening a lot. It's not just, people think of baseball usually, but it happens in other sports too. There's a lot of professional Cuban volleyball players that play in European leagues. And I remember in just a couple years ago, I think it was 2021, Cuba had this amazing triple jumper, a young guy. I think he was maybe 19 or he was very young. He left his Cuban delegation. He defected to Spain because he was offered Spanish citizenship and a big contract to train in Spain and compete for Spain. And he did get his citizenship. A year later, in 2022, he became a Spanish citizen. And now he competes for Spain in triple jump, and he's one of the best in the world. His name was Jordan Diaz. So, and he when asked the reasons for him going to Spain, it was basically about economics and opportunity. It had nothing to do with politics, but even still, right? So that's how the blockade is, and this new really harsh immigration policy, which is almost practically banning Cubans from coming to the United States or competing or training in U.S. territory. It's having a really harmful effect on Cuban sports and athletics. And I'm not sure what's going to happen with the Summer Olympics coming up in Los Angeles, for a lot of these athletes, these Cuban athletes, if they can't participate in their qualifying competitions. So that's not looking good. And there is outcry, not just from Cuba, but from some other countries are very disgusted with what the United States is doing to Cuban athletes and how they're being excluded and blocked from participating. So the blockade is affecting Cuban sports, unfortunately.
Well, not just Cuban sports. It's very clearly, as you lay out, an attempt to humiliate Cuban culture, because baseball, for example, one example, as we've discussed, is such an important facet of Cuban nation craft and cultural participation and so on. But it's an attempt to kneecap Cuban athletes. It's basically fixing the results of the games, as you describe the ways in which teams rank. And that should concern anybody who cares about sportsmanship. It should concern anybody who cares about the international spirit in which these events are convened, and really just any athlete. I was reading about a Brazilian table tennis player who isn't allowed to compete in the United States simply because he's been to Cuba. So
that's right, yeah.
This should frighten anybody who cares about the very basic premises of sport and cultural exchange and so on. And of course, it should also offend anybody concerned with the dignity of the Cuban people. That should be everyone. But it's another respect in which you can see that these attacks degrade every institution by which they transpire. You know, if you attack Cuba through sport, through entertainment, through the popular press, you are in some way insulting the integrity of those very institutions, you know?
Yeah.
And another thing, I mean, to speak of children and dashing children's dreams, the Cuban deputy foreign minister made a really salty post in the aftermath of this, saying that the United States is a country where there are serious accusations of pedophilia involving politicians and prominent figures. And in light of this, the denial to escorts of a Cuban children's sports team is very ironic. He said plainly that the United States isn't capable of ensuring the safety of minors and doesn't qualify to host sports events in that regard. So,
Kidding.
Pretty salty, but where's the lie, as they say?
Yeah.
And
exactly.
And that's a good pivot to another remarkable development of the week, I think, which is that the draft bill for the Code of Children, Adolescents, and Youth was unanimously approved by the Cuban parliament. So this is a great development. Of course, there was already robust legislation protecting children, adolescents, and youth in place, but this further solidifies the rights of minors in Cuban society, and you can see the progress that is consistently being made as regards this matter. You know, it builds out from the world-renowned Families Code, passed in 2022, which very importantly sets forth the principle of progressive autonomy for youth. And I think it's worth pausing on that because it's not something that's really respected or spoken about in Canada or the United States, I think. But it appears in Article 5, I'm fairly certain, of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it's profound. It names the responsibility of caregivers to support the evolving capacities of the child. and insists that children are not static, irresponsible subjects, but should be able to exercise their rights and pursue their interests and desires as their capacities allow and as their capacities develop, And when we speak about that development, it doesn't set forth any kind of formulaic or rigorously staged conception of childhood and its capabilities, but understands that this changes depending on familial and cultural and socioeconomic environments, and it's very dynamic. So the Cuban Families Code names the responsibility of adults to accompany children, quote, in accordance with their progressive autonomy in the construction of their own identity. And this is further developed in this new code for children. I can't help but compare that to the moral panic transpiring in a lot of Canadian schools right now, where the right is attacking school boards, and I believe it's part of a program to attack the basic premises of public education. But there's this prefab moral panic concerning sex ed and the autonomy of children to determine their own gender identity and to have that respected in a school environment, even if perhaps it isn't respected in their home. And this has been a flashpoint topic. It's been a pet project of the right in Canada, is to erode the autonomy of children in schools and actually attack the curriculum that might empower them to better express themselves, whether that concerns gender or any number of other things.
Right.
Couldn't be more different in Cuba. I also was just speaking in a nationwide colloquium on the matter of police-free schools as a human right and the ways that children are surveilled in schools by a police presence across Canada, and the way that this involves racial profiling and very bad outcomes for people with disabilities and so on. And by contrast, the Cuban Code of Children, Adolescents, and Youth, it not only buttresses the Families Code and its affordance of freedom and dignity to the desires of children, but includes a really robust thinking of the conditions for effective equality. So this takes into account factors such as gender, disability, sexual orientation, migratory status, all kinds of social mediations that are going to influence the outcomes that this code is supposed to protect and ensure. So it's a remarkable document. In many other respects, it prohibits corporal punishment in home and care settings is something that we also see in Article 146 of the Families Code. Cuba's education system is already renowned, but this really builds out the right to education from everything I've read. So it's so important to the posterity of the revolution, where Diaz-Canel is frequently making these appeals to youth and talking about the quality of youth participation in the future of the revolution. And you can't imagine such a project without the legal accompaniment and the legal protection that this code affords. So it would be remarkable in itself, but when you look at how children fare in Canada and in the United States, it's just stark. The difference is just stark in how people speak about the rights of children here as opposed to Cuba.
Yeah. It's really underreported, and especially where we are. But there's not a lot of attention given to the real gains and progress that they make on these fronts. and we need to talk about it more and put it out there. There was at the Pride March in Toronto, the Cuba Solidarity organizations had a contingent in the parade, and it was really exciting to see some people on the sidelines who actually had heard of the Families Code, for example, and were really excited to see Cuba, local Cuban groups and Cuban solidarity groups represented by that contingent. And they really celebrated Cuba's advancements there. And but that was at Pride, of course. But like in the general population, I feel like people are not informed about these gains that are made on in these areas. So, yeah.
Not at all. It's one of the many respects in which Cuba is badly understood here, and there are powerful interests that would like to keep it that way. When you read about something like the new childhood code in anti-Cuban media, shall we say bourgeois or imperialist media, they have to contort themselves to pretend that this is a bad thing somehow. I read an article in Cyber Cuba talking about how the language of comprehensive protection and the best interests of the child and the development of personality as a right and so on actually allude to indoctrination rather than the child's autonomy, you know? Mm-hmm. It's not serious, but you can't prevent the anti-Cuba people from construing every progressive development as some kind of terrible repression, you know?
Yeah. Oh my God. Exactly. It's a really good way of putting it.
And to that end, there was a very interesting development this week where the Minister of Labor and Social Security, Marta Elena Feto Cabrera, was compelled to resign by a popular outcry after some remarks about precariously housed and ambulatory people in Cuba were badly received. And this is a really interesting moment of popular participation in democracy and the self-correcting capacity of the Cuban political process. And it was just portrayed in a lot of media here as a straightforward firing or something like this. And I think that the actual context of those remarks in the story is probably a lot more interesting than that.
Yeah. To sum it up, she made comments. She denied the existence of people begging in Cuba, making the assertion that people were pretending to be beggars to make easy money, that they didn't want to work, or that they were just trying to get money to buy alcohol, and that, you know, that kind of blaming the victim, basically. And let's just point out that for a very long time, up until very recently, there really wasn't any of that in Cuba. But how many years a Trump administration, a Biden administration, another Trump administration tightening the noose around Cuba, the economic siege has affected the economy so severely that it is resulting in many more vulnerable people in Cuba, and the government is having a hard time coming up with the resources to keep everybody above a certain standard. There's a housing backlog, right? They don't have the materials that they need to be able to build all the new housing that is needed in Cuba. So if buildings are in disrepair, if they become unsafe to live in, usually what people end up doing is they end up moving in with, like, it's you get more crowded households because people are consolidating, and families might have to more under one roof or something. But there is much more precarity. We should never deny that, because to address the root of any problem, you have to first acknowledge that there is an issue. Now, obviously, we will always call out the blockade as the primary and overwhelming source of these economic issues. There's objectively really no question about that. But this minister, for whatever reason, I'm really not sure what she was thinking, how she thought this was going to be received, but she not only denied the presence of people rummaging for things in the street or begging, but she actually blamed them and said that they were like frauds, pretending. And this caused outrage among Cubans, other government officials, other members of the National Assembly, ordinary citizens, intellectuals, artists, everybody. They were just shocked that she would say these things. And even the president himself criticized Fado Cabrera at the parliamentary session, saying, the leadership of Cuba can't act with condescension or be disconnected from the realities of the people. So I can't say what was going through her mind or what does go through her mind, because it doesn't sound like it was just a one-off thing. She prepared. This was I think it was a report she was giving, or a statement. So it's not like, I don't know, but to me, she wasn't maybe the best person to be in that position, and she has resigned after a lot of pressure from the Cuban people and other members of the Cuban government. So people in Cuba found it really insulting what she was saying, and many Cubans weren't blaming the government for the economic situation that we are seeing some of these conditions, but they're saying, how can you blame ordinary Cuban people, or people, and some people were even saying too, even if someone is an alcoholic or has addiction, they need help. We don't blame them. They need help. We don't treat them that way. And I think President Diaz-Canel said the same thing too, or maybe I'm thinking of another prominent Cuban, because I was just reading so much comments and responses on social media from government officials and Cuban artists and things like that. And they're saying, let's say some of these people do struggle with addiction, and what? Like, nobody deserves that. And it's not like it's the government's fault. To blame the Cuban government is incorrect, and it's dishonest, and it's cynical, but they have to find a way to address these problems.
Yeah, well, and the increasing sort of lumpenizing effects of the blockade on more and greater numbers of people are intended. And I think that Diaz-Canel does something very profound, where the intent of the blockade is to produce social stratification and discontent. Yeah. And that has to be part of our counter narrative. When people say, oh, look, this is an outcome of socialist planning. No, this is the outcome of a capitalist blockade. The output of capitalism is social stratification, right? So I think that he does something very profound when he refuses to artificially separate out these social strata, and says that the revolution doesn't consider anybody in such a position to be an enemy of the state, and everyone is collectively responsible for everyone else. That's a very profound anti-capitalist logic in itself, I think, And I was thinking about this recently because I read a beautiful novel, The Transparency of Time, by the Cuban novelist Leonardo Padura, right? Quite renowned author of noir. And I was thinking, what is the significance of socialist noir, right? Its ability to disclose some of the ambiguities of the blockade and the post-Soviet era, because noir as a genre really, really specifically concerns the descent of the hard-boiled detective, the descent of social strata, and kind of penetrating this underworld or an outskirts or something like this that really ought not to exist in a socialist society. So I was reading this book that does have to do with the underbelly and the outskirts of Havana and that kind of life. And I was thinking, oh, that's such an interesting artistic response to the production of inequality by the blockade, you know? And while we try to correctly diagnose these problems, and while Diaz-Canel tries to correctly diagnose these problems, and as you say, so many people from every area of Cuban society have made really interesting responses to this error of speech and analysis by the minister, the former minister. We should really insist that these social difficulties will be better treated by a society such as Cuba is.
Yes. I mean, even so, even what they're going through right now, compare that to other capitalist countries in the world, to the majority of capitalist countries in the world. The situation is much more stark. It's much more severe. It's there's so much more poverty and violence. So it's very troubling and concerning that Cuba is dealing with this right now. But you have a government, you have a system, a political system that actually seeks to objectively and honestly and scientifically address these problems. So they're doing everything that they can. And the more I hear him speak and the more we're seeing what Cuba is dealing with in the face of the imperialist United States, the more respect I gain for President Miguel Diaz-Canel. He's a great leader for Cuba right now, and he's honest, about this. He said, these people who we might describe whether homeless or they're linked to begging, these are concrete expressions of the social inequalities and the accumulated problems that we face right now, he said. And he said, the vulnerable are not our enemies. So we should not be stigmatizing these people. It's a symptom of a problem, and we want to address it, and we will address it, and it exists. Yeah.
And likewise, we can't allow enemies of the Cuban people to scapegoat Miguel Diaz-Canel for the problems that he has to confront in his presidency. All I would say to conclude is that if every minister in the Canadian or the United States government who said something nasty about unhoused people or drug users were forced to resign, we wouldn't have a government.
Yeah, exactly.
El día primero aquel, lleno de emoción y ruido, alguien dijo conmovido y feliz, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel.